Welcome everyone. We're just going to wait a couple of minutes for everyone to join in.
Hi everyone, and a really warm welcome to today's King's Expert Series webinar on the US under Biden. This event is part of our online events series for our global alumni community, where each month you can tune in and hear from some of our leading academics, researchers and practitioners on some of the most pressing issues of our time. In case you missed any of our previous King's Expert Series webinars, you can find them on the King's Alumni YouTube channel. And just to note that today's event is also being streamed live on YouTube. So today, our expert panel will share their perspectives on some of the implications of recent events in the US and what these could mean for the country and its place on the international stage. So I'm delighted to introduce our panel for today's discussion. We've shared their bios in advance, but I'll just give a quick introduction. So for our chair for today is Professor Funmi Olonasakin, Vice President and Vice Principal International and Professor of Security, Leadership and Development at King's. Funmi is joined by Professors Dr. Samuel DeCanio, a lecturer in the Department of Political Economy at King's, and Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman, Erasmus Professor of War Studies at King's College London. Just a couple of quick notes on the format for today's events. So following introductory remarks from our panel, we'll then move to Q&A from the audience. And thank you to those of you who have submitted your questions in advance. If you've got a question that you'd like to ask during the webinar, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. As we've got so many people on the webinar today, we might not have a chance to answer all of your questions, but we will do our best to get through as many as we can. The other way that you can participate is that you can press the like button on other people's questions, and that will help us to know which questions are the most popular. And lastly, as usual, you can continue the discussion after the event on LinkedIn. Just make sure to use the hashtag King's Expert Series. So with that, I'm delighted to hand over to Funmi to chair today's discussion.
Thank you so much. Let me start by saying a warm welcome and greetings to our alumni wherever you are in the world. It's always a great pleasure to have you. Clearly, it's just been an interesting year, an interesting 4 years, if you like, an interesting 2021 since January 20th. We have seen momentous change in the US. The Biden presidency it has inherited an enormous set of challenges. But whilst some have been really grappling with the question of COVID, there are also a lot of questions that are being raised and that we don't have sufficient answers to, and we can't have sufficient answers to them, because the Biden presidency raises some expectations, not just at home, but abroad as well, that things will suddenly click back to where they were. Some might even expect that this is a continuation of Obama's, presidency, in other ways, And we have heard comments to that effect, not least because of some of the appointments that have been made as well. But the question of, the polarization of the US society has remained. It remains a factor that, has occupied the news at home and abroad. Will the US simply enter, step back into a multilateral life without any consequences? Will the EU accept that the US is back in the way that is being said in the UK? Has China occupied this space for good? The space that was occupied well by the US? How about Africa? How about immigration? How about climate change? Are we going to see a sudden shift in the swing of things that in the ways that we hadn't seen in the last 4 years? These are some of the questions, only a few of the questions that we have been discussing in different fora since Biden assumed presidency of the US. And it's my pleasure to have our two panelists with us. Dr. Sam DiCanio, is a pleasure to see you here, but it's especially a great pleasure to have my own mentor and professor on the panel, Professor Sir Laurie Friedman. Nice to have you. But so we're going to have a full hour of discussion, debate, excitement, and I welcome you to this talk now, Dr. Samuel DiCanio. You have about 7 minutes to, highlight any of these issues, any questions, or make the points that you find really pertinent to make about the Biden presidency at this moment. Over to you.
Well, thank you so much for that invitation to speak here, and thanks so much to the Alumni Office for inviting me to be part of this event. I hope it's going to be really enjoyable. I've been looking forward to it, and thanks so much for everybody for tuning in and remaining in contact with King's College London. I was asked, one of the questions I was asked to sort of think about in my introductory remarks was to address what I think the major challenges will be facing the Biden administration as it starts in its initial months in power. And I think that some of the challenges that the Biden administration will face involve issues that would be confronting any American president that was beginning their term in office. And some of them are more specific to the outcome of the 2020 election and factors associated with the fact that they're inheriting an American political system following the presidency of Donald Trump. So I wanted to start by just discussing a couple of sort of the major issues that Biden is going to be confronting, that any US president would be struggling with and dealing with right now. I think that one of the principal issues that Biden is going to have to confront is his policy toward China. So the U.S. is in a situation right now where it's facing a rising power as China's economy has developed. Its military capabilities have also expanded in kind. And Biden is going to have to address a series of strategic and economic issues that China poses to the US in novel ways. On the economic side of things, he's going to have to determine whether or not he wants to continue the same kinds of adversarial and confrontational economic policies that the Trump administration had adopted. So he's going to have to determine whether or not he's willing to engage in trade wars, whether or not he's comfortable using the same kinds of tariffs that the Trump administration was willing to use, whether or not the economic consequences of doing so are going to be worth the political advantages that he might be able to extract from their employment. There are wide ranges of areas where the US and China can sort of mutually interact on economic issues. And he's going to have to sort of navigate his relationship with China and determine how much of the sort of Trump era policies he's going to be adopting. On the strategic side of things, Biden is confronted with a Chinese power which has been focused on modernizing its military. So over the past couple of decades, China has been advancing across its army, its naval capabilities, and its air force. And I think that the particular focus here and the challenge that Biden is going to be looking at is going to be focused on naval issues. China has had a somewhat contentious relationship with Taiwan, and the U.S. vis-a-vis its relationship with Taiwan as well. It's also been engaged in militarizing the South China Sea. And this is going to be a sort of the primary theater of operations where I think there's room for tension to develop even further between the US and China. China has also been developing military capabilities in the naval sphere. So it's embarked on a program to develop aircraft carriers. It currently has 2 aircraft carriers, which are somewhat limited in their ability to actually project power. Mainly because they lack the catapult technology, which is necessary to actually deliver naval aviation that's fully fueled and fully armed. So planes have to be somewhat light in order to actually take off from Chinese aircraft carriers, and this limits their ability to effectively use their carrier fleet to project power. This is going to change in the coming years, however. So China has embarked on a program to develop an indigenous carrier manufacturing capability. And they're working on aircraft carriers that have advanced catapult technology, which will allow it to project power in a similar way as the US does with its carrier strike fleets. Aside from China, another major issue that Biden is going to have to confront involves COVID. So if I had been sort of asked to reflect on the challenges that the Biden administration is going to confront in its initial months in office, a few weeks ago, I think that I probably would have said that COVID is the #1 issue that he has to address. But I think that's slightly changed in the past month or so. We've seen that the COVID infection rates in the US have been falling dramatically. And I think that this has taken a little bit of pressure off of the urgency with which Biden has to focus on COVID to the exclusion of everything else. The falling rates have to do probably a combination of factors. The U.S. has been relatively effective in vaccinating large numbers of its population. So I believe that it's got around 20% of its population vaccinated now. And obviously it's concentrated on some of the oldest American citizens who are most vulnerable to COVID. So Biden seems to be doing all of the right things. He's making sure that the supply of vaccines are expanding. He's setting targets which are increasingly ambitious in terms of how many vaccinations each day should be occurring. So the medical side of things, it's still very worrisome, and it's just absolutely horrible that we've had 500,000 Americans lose their lives so far. But it looks as though things are moving in the right direction, and hopefully that will simply continue. I think that Biden, however, does need to continue to focus. He has to focus intensely on the economic side of COVID. So the economic damage that's been occurring as a result of the sort of the shutdown of the U.S. economy has been quite extensive, and here it appears as though he's taking very aggressive actions in terms of this, the 1.9 trillion stimulus package that he's putting together, or that the U.S. Congress is putting together. And it looks as though he's taking pretty aggressive actions on that front. The Fed has also been very nimble in its response. In March of 2020, it engaged in an extensive program of quantitative easing, where it purchased corporate debt, it purchased mortgage-backed securities, and it looks as though it's managed to sort of stabilize the stock market and keep things from really going downhill in the way they sort of looked as if they were about to in March of 2020. I think that the third and final thing to just mention in terms of the challenges that Biden is going to face involve a political condition and a limiting factor on his policy agenda. That's a result of the 2020 elections. And here I'm specifically thinking of the fact that the Senate is essentially split between Democrats and Republicans. And I think that this is something that's very important to keep in mind, because it indicates that although the Democrats have a 1-vote majority, they're going to be quite limited in the kinds of policies that they can actually pass through because of the resistance they're going to face in the Senate. And not only can the Republicans resort to filibustering legislation, they can also appeal to conservative Democrats like Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia, who are simply not going to be rubber stamping the policies and legislative agenda that Biden might want to actually implement. So I think those are sort of three of the main challenges, three of the main challenging areas that Biden is going to be confronting: relationship with China, dealing with the medical and economic side of the COVID crisis, and the fact that the relatively even partisan split that exists in the Senate is going to sort of limit his policy flexibility in ways that Obama in 2008 did not necessarily face.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Now let's move over to Professor Sir Lawrence Freedman.
Hi, good to be with you all. And I've got at least one old student there, but maybe there's more amongst the audience. So Sam has already mentioned China, and correctly, as being a factor which looms large both on the domestic and the international side because of the economic impact of the trade war with China. But let me just talk about some of the other foreign policy challenges that are faced. Obviously, the election of Biden was greeted with no relief. I think I'm not quite sure whether the system as we know it could have survived another 4 years of Trump, not least because it was he was undermining the American brand, and his last couple of months in office potentially undermined it even more. So we now have a normal American government with people who know how to speak to the international community, doing normal things, not relying on tweets all the time. So that in itself is a comfort. But it doesn't mean to say that there isn't a legacy left by Trump that's one that Biden's got to deal with. If we say start with Europe, Trump clearly was uncomfortable with alliances, uncomfortable with free trade. Biden comes back and is fine with both. But in the meantime, in the EU, we see now talk of from President Macron of strategic autonomy, the idea that Europe just daren't rely on the United States in the way it did in the past. It has to be much more self-assured and be prepared to take different positions from the Americans. And actually, China emerges quite quickly as one of those where the EU may be taking a slightly softer line. I'll very briefly mention the UK at this point. The UK, I think, made a decision a few months ago, before they could even be sure that Biden would be elected, to align themselves with Biden. So at the moment, the UK is giving most support to the new administration, for example, on China, for example, the promotion of democracy, and particularly in issue for Biden as well as here on climate change, which is going to be a big theme of this year. The EU, more widely though, is less sure, and that indicates part of the legacy of doubt being sown about the nature of American commitment to its allies. The administration has said that the focus will move away from the Middle East to the Asia, or now what we used to call the Asia-Pacific region, we now call the Indo-Pacific region. And I think that will continue a trend that we've seen Obama through Trump, which is essentially the US doesn't need the Middle East like it used to need the Middle East. It doesn't take oil from the Middle East. And the way that things have lined up there, it's not clear that its major allies particularly need the US in the way that they might have needed them in the past, other than the issue of Iran. So what's happened in the past with the Middle East is the United States says it wants to stay out of trouble, and then trouble comes up anyway, and it finds itself engaged. And there's a number of factors that could pull this in. Essentially, what's happened in the Middle East is a polarization has developed between Iran and its clients, none of whom are very strong at the moment, and Israel and the Gulf states, which is sort of an unusual and unexpected alliance to some, but it's been developing for some time, and it defines itself in opposition to Iran, with countries like Egypt, which used to be very important in Middle Eastern politics, taking almost a holiday from geopolitical affairs. Now, what you do about Iran is an immediate issue, because Trump backed off from the JCPOA, the agreement which contained Iran's nuclear ambitions. Biden indicated he wanted to go back, but it's not an easy game to play. The Iranians have done things that they wouldn't have been allowed to do had the agreement fully stayed in place. They've got their own elections, which do matter to them, coming up in the summer. And I think what we're seeing at the moment is that it's going to be quite difficult to go back to the position of 2016. And you may have to do, I mean, it may be that all we can is quite limited concessions on both sides just to stop things falling apart. But you've also got issues like Lebanon, which are quite, I mean, it's basically another failed state now, because after the large explosion in Beirut last year and the impact of COVID and the economic situation. So there's a risk always in the Middle East of things just moving out of anybody's control. And even though the United States would rather not pay attention, it may find it has little choice. Let me just quickly say something about the Indo-Pacific side of things. Sam said and all the important things about China. It's worth noting that part of the philosophy that Biden's appointees and he himself bring to it is a stress on democratization and also human rights. Now, I think in terms of the values of Western countries, this is fine, but in terms of international politics, it could well produce some tensions. For example, there's much to complain about in the Chinese human rights record, but issues developing with India as well. And frankly, most of the countries you're going to have to work with in that part of the world are not going to be, are not particularly keen on that part of the Biden message. So there's going to be compromises made there. And it's a complex part of the world. It's not simple. And a lot of the things that the Trump administration claimed to be dealing with, like North Korea, are still there as big problems. So I think to conclude, Biden has appointed a very strong foreign policy team. They know their way around. I don't think it's a return to the interventionism of old, whatever's been said. I think Biden certainly doesn't want to get involved in any more Iraq or Afghan type wars. But they have alliance commitments that could be challenged. And I think there's going to be, as always with the new administration, a sort of a slightly uncertain period while they feel their way around, with always the risk of some event, some part of the world that nobody's paying much attention to, perhaps say in North Africa, that suddenly erupts and gives you a crisis to deal with. But I'll stop there and hopefully we can have a conversation in the questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you to both of you. And I think we're going to start with some questions, but I wanted to just ask a couple of questions of my own. Sam, I wonder whether you can reflect on January 6th and the lingering impact of all the events of January 6th, notwithstanding that we've seen, Trump was impeached, not convicted. Now the clamor to have further trials of sort outside of Senate. How would what impact will the lingering effect of this have on the Biden administration, do you think? Is that going to be a distraction if you have Trump's trial in other ways or various trials going on? Would that be a distraction for Biden?
I don't know if I would necessarily say it would be a distraction from Biden. I think that there would be a lot of interest and a lot of focus on it. I guess one of the things that I've been impressed by was that at the very tail end of the Trump administration, when you had the riots in the Capitol building, it seems as though he sort of completely lost control of the message. His claims that the election had actually been fraudulent, that he'd actually won. And what you wound up seeing was behavior on the part of his supporters that I think did quite a bit to delegitimize the tail end of Trump's presidency. And so I think that his claims that the election was illegitimate, it just became a sideshow to the fact that we saw this, these horrible events where people were losing their lives. You had the storming of the Capitol, you had destruction to one of the central institutions of the US government. Mm-hmm. And I think that Americans reacted in a way that was just very I was going to say very negative, but very negative toward Trump. They saw this as an unusual and illegitimate form of behavior. And I think that this will merely continue if there are additional investigations into him, whether this involves his political actions or whether or not it involves his issues surrounding his taxes and the financial dealings that he had. There are so many things about the Trump administration which were unusual. And I can't think of a president that left office under this much controversy and under this much sort of negative pressure, where it looks as though they might be facing legal proceedings across a range of different issues. And I just think that there was sort of a series of events at the very end of his presidency which really did a lot to undermine his ability to legitimately claim that he had any sort of claim to political power. And subsequent investigations, if they do occur, I think will just sort of do more along that path.
Thank you. I wanted to start with Trump and the legacy of Trump, which Laurie made mention of at the very start, because Laurie, you did say that you're not sure that system would have lasted, and I agree that it could have lasted another 4 years at that pace is really in doubt. But nonetheless, there are some legacies. I can't tell whether so maybe a combination of positive or negative. And I wonder whether one of those legacies, is what we're seeing in Europe, or even when we think of how Biden might respond to China, that is going to be both, he's going to need to compete with China. The US will compete with China, but also need to cooperate with China. You see how the rest of the world in Africa were, retorting, saying to the US, anytime there was commentary on Ethiopia or any other place, why don't you get your own house in order? Do you think that kind of legacy is going to be a major challenge abroad for Biden?
Yeah, I think on the, in two senses. First, it tarnished the image, but secondly, it encouraged this view of a complete lack of steadiness in American policy, that you have one administration that goes one way, then the next administration goes the other. Actually, one of the questions is asked about, lots have been done by executive orders, so could the next administration come in and undo all those executive orders and so on, which is essentially what Biden has done to Trump. So I think the lack of continuity and solidity in policy is a worry. Therefore, how much can you rely? Secondly, I think the new administration has got to be careful not to be an administration purely of threats and sanctions, which is what Trump ended up in many ways being. It'd be interesting to see what Samantha Power does as head of USAID. But as many people have notice one of the things China has done with Belt and Road, or you can see it now with the sort of vaccine diplomacy of China and Russia, is to make an offering to developing countries that can be matched by the West. In some cases is, but it's not as strategic as certainly as China has been. I think China's approach has got a lot of problems as well, so I don't think one should be in awe of it, but it's certainly there, and the Americans and with their allies need a much more positive response to it, and show that they're interested. I think they can do that, but it's going to take time.
No, thank you. Let me look at the questions that are coming up, and I want to put two up. Laurie, you already responded to Jamie Thompson's question in a sense, because this point you're making about, after 28 executive orders, another, a new Republican government can come in and simply reverse that. I think you've addressed that thoroughly. Abir Omer, War Studies Alumni, is asking, in the light of the US political progress, what would the migration trends look like? I want us to take this because you can respond to either of these two questions. I want us to also consider Michael Kemp's question. During the Trump, Tillerson, Pompeo years, we heard a lot about the damage to the US's diplomatic infrastructure caused by the management of the State Department. How serious, lasting, or irreparable within the current Biden administration do you think these problems are? So if the infrastructure in the State Department itself is essentially broken, notwithstanding that you have some good appointees, what is likely to happen here? Please respond to any of these two questions. Anyone?
Sam could deal with the demographics. And I'll just say, I'm sorry for putting it on to Sam, and I deal with the State Department. I mean, it's a real issue. I mean, it was hollowed out. Lots of good people left. Some may come back. I think one of the fortunate things about the Democrats scraping through in the Senate is that the political appointments are being ratified, with one or two exceptions, but by and large, not having the problems that we could have seen there with a Republican majority. But they've got to, there's a lot that needs to be done. I mean, you had a completely demoralized State Department. Oddly, you've got the opportunity for a reinvigorated State Department, because I think Biden will rely on them more. Though I think the White House will still be taking, as always it does, and it's got a very strong national security advisor, so the White House will be taking a lead. I think that a lot more will be done through diplomacy than was done under Trump.
May I just quickly ask a question to Laurie on this front? So the question here was asking about sort of lasting damage to the State Department, and the primary thing that you just mentioned is that the State Department will be less demoralized. That's the morale of an executive agency is always important. But do you see the damage extending beyond that? If the primary issue is just the demoralization of the State Department, that seems like something that should be relatively easy to sort of fix and to bring back relatively quickly. And that seems to in my mind suggest that there won't be any sort of lasting damage as a result of this.
No, I mean, I think I can come back. I mean, it just takes time. There's a lot of recruitment, but there's an awful lot of people who've been kicking the heels over the last 4 years who are desperate to get into government. So there's no shortage of good people around. It's just getting them there, getting their clearances. I mean, it just takes an awfully long time, even in the best of circumstances, to start a new American administration.
Mm. Indeed. Sam, how about the immigration question? Of course, we've had how many executive orders, and I think immigration is one of them. So, what do you think will happen realistically, though?
Yeah. So on the immigration front, Biden has already rescinded a bunch of the executive orders that Trump had signed. And let me just sort of say something at the very beginning here, just about executive orders. The use of executive orders, it's sort of a feature of contemporary American politics, but this is not necessarily historically new. So if you look at prior presidents, FDR had over 3,000 executive orders that he signed. Teddy Roosevelt had over 1,000. And so this is not the use of executive orders. It's something that presidents have historically resorted to throughout American history. In terms of the immigration issue, the fact that Trump had sort of made so much policy through executive orders on the immigration front made it relatively easy for Biden to just sort of remove some of these obstacles. And he's proposing an 8-year plan for citizenship for DACA immigrants. The refugee policy is being rolled back. He's getting rid of Trump's efforts to sort of use detention centers in Mexico to prevent immigrants coming into the United States, being processed by immigration authorities and then released into the U.S. population with the request that they subsequently show up to judicial proceedings. So it looks like it's the sort of much of the Trump efforts during his presidency are being rolled back, and it's sort of a return to the prior status quo that existed before Trump. It seems like the ICE raids are not going to be on Biden's agenda. They're not going to be very high on Biden's agenda, if you will. So yeah, it just looks like much of what Trump had done is being removed.
Okay, just let me push further on that. So are you foreseeing more executive orders, especially if there's, if he can't get things through Senate, for example, or are we likely to see Kamala Harris show up a few times in the Senate just to try to force some things through?
So I think she's going to have to. And the question just becomes whether or not the sort of conservative Democrats can be swayed one way or another, whether or not the Republicans are successful in using the filibuster to oppose things. But there's room for action via executive order if that's the avenue that Biden decides he wants to go down. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Laurie, there's now the Russia question, which I think somehow people think that the threat or the visibility of Putin after Trump is not is not really there at this point in time. But Colin Whittington is asking, what will and should Biden's priorities in policy be towards Putin's Russia? Does Russia matter that much at this point in time compared to China?
It doesn't matter as much as China. It matters because it's still a nuclear power. So one of the things that Biden has done is to extend New START for 5 years, which is a good thing, because if you didn't have that, you wouldn't have any actual arms control agreement at all left, really, between the two countries. So you've got a focus for continual discussions on the main distinct and the most important thing that Russia has at the moment, which is its nuclear superpower. Russia is a power in the Middle East now because of Syria. It's got an awkward legacy there, but it's as likely to be engaged now on some issues as the United States is. So you need some sort of deconfliction activities with Russia there. And then you've still got Ukraine, which has not been solved. And I'm not quite sure what the solution is. Plus, you've got the issues of internal Russian democracy in Navalny and so on. So, I mean, I think it'll be quite low key. I think that whatever Putin hoped he might achieve with Trump, he hasn't achieved, apart from maybe messing up American democracy for a bit. So I think you'll have correct relations with Russia, but I don't. But I, there's a sense almost now that although he's hanging on to power, his appetite for it is diminishing, and it's just not clear how much of a momentum there's going to be behind the Russian power pushes that there've been of recent times. So it's there, but I think China's going to dominate the discussion.
So Laurie, you know, that just felt like I was sitting in your MA class.
Issues don't change either.
Interesting. So now you have a former student of yours, Richard Bolaran. How worrying is the Trumpist power base itself? And he actually does say from a former student of Professor Friedman, currently marooned in Florida. So actually, Trump's neighbor at the moment.
Yeah, it's the worst places to be marooned, I suppose. Well, it's one for some, I think, as well. I think the events of 6th of January were startling. And you now have a third, more than a third of the Americans who believe that the election was stolen, who would probably join a Trump party. I think it raises enormous issues for the Republican Party. And in a sense, what went on probably lost them the Senate. You would normally have expected them to have won the 2 Georgia Senate seats. And so the 2022 midterms loom very large now, because under normal ways you would expect the Democrats to struggle. The party in power often struggles in the midterms. And if the Democrats struggle, they could lose both houses. They don't have much of a margin in either. But if the Republicans are still divided in this sort of way, then maybe the Democrats could come through. But I think Sam probably better placed on that than I am.
No. Thank you, Sam. You can respond to any of this. You might even want to comment on that as well. But Benedict Owens is asking, how high on the agenda for Biden is a potential trade deal with the UK? Is the US likely to join the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, the CPTPP, anytime soon? So you just pick your...
Yeah, so I have not seen much suggesting that a trade deal with the UK is especially high on the Biden agenda. But it might just be that it's still a little bit early for that to emerge. But I just haven't seen much. I don't really have much to say on that. In terms of the rejoining the Comprehensive Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, Biden was apparently quite angry when Trump withdrew from TIP in the first instance. And so I would not be surprised if he began trying to re-engage at some level. But I haven't seen a huge amount of coverage on that. I'd be curious to hear if Laurie had seen something more specific than that. I do think that Laurie is right to point to the pressure that the Biden administration is going to be feeling in terms of the approaching midterm elections. The Democrats underperformed in the House by a wide range of measures during the 2020 election. It really did look as though Americans were quite willing to split their tickets. It was, and in that sense, I actually think it really was a repudiation of Trump. There are, large numbers of Americans that will answer on survey questions. They will say yes, they think the election was illegitimate, was stolen. But I think that the underperformance of the Democrats in the House in the 2020 election is not a good signal for expectations in the approaching midterms. And it looks as though the Senate is going to be relatively close as well. Whether the Senate goes 2 votes in either direction, I think the fact that it's starting from such an evenly split position is just a problem for Biden, regardless of whether or not they manage to pick up 1 or 2 seats. Given that you have a group of conservative Democrats that are probably quite willing and quite open to stymieing aspects of his legislative agenda. If he tries to, for example, push through gun control legislation, as he's indicated that he wants to try to create a federal registry for assault rifles. I'm skeptical that he's going to be able to get that through, given that the Democratic senators are like, some of them are likely to vote against it.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, just to I mean, I think that that's right. Although, of course, the prospect of losing the midterms also create whatever legislative stuff you can get through as soon as possible. Just on the CPTPP and Brexit, a trade deal for the UK with the US is just difficult. I mean, the issues are very difficult. I think it would be, whatever people say, would have been even more difficult under Trump. And Biden is not going to rush on trade. And this is where the House is relevant to that as well, because you need the House for trade deals. And the Democrats have historically not actually been that great enthusiasts for more trade deals. So I think caution there. Interestingly, the UK has put in an application to join the CTPTPP. I always get the acronym wrong. And which I think is quite likely to be accepted. So that adds quite an interesting dimension to the problem. The UK will be pushing. I mean, quite a lot of work was done under Trump on a deal, so it's not as if you'd be starting from scratch. But I think it's just not that high on the Biden agenda, and you've still got the Northern Ireland issues, which could complicate it.
No, thanks. A couple of questions here. I have one of my own, by the way, which has to do with whether actually the Republican Party is going to remain this way, or maybe it might split. Bless you. Carla Fernandez, language and cultural diversity, a very recent graduate, actually, as of 2020. She says, for 4 years, Trump provided speeches that resulted in the emergence of a new political rhetoric based on a simple, informal, pompous, and repetitive language. How do you value Biden's switch to a more traditional form of political rhetoric? Do you think language choices are relevant to American citizens? And I wonder whether, Sam, you want to start with this. But there's also another one. There has been a good discussion on whether US traditional allies can rely on the US moving forward. But what impact will this doubt among allies have on the Biden administration's ability to depend on those same foreign allies? I think, Laurie, you had alluded to this to an extent earlier. So there you go, Sam.
So on the issue of rhetoric, I guess there are sort of two things to keep in mind here. On the one hand, Trump did use Twitter using a style that was just unprecedented. I mean, he was sort of took vulgarity to a different level. It did not sort of exhibit the kind of restraint that you're used to seeing from American presidents. And I think it's on the one hand, it's very easy to say that that's something that's displeasing. On the other hand, the unfortunate reality is that I think it was that exact same rhetoric that enabled him to stand out from a very crowded stage of Republican primary challengers. And it was, in a sense, I think a lot of people found it interesting in ways that they don't traditionally find. Interesting might not be the right word. They found it entertaining at some level. It was engaging. They paid attention to Trump. There were a huge number of people that were following and commenting on Trump's tweets constantly throughout his entire presidency, throughout his candidacy. And I don't know how much of that was something that was caused by I don't know if Trump is going to cause a shift in political rhetoric, and that he was sort of the causal agent that led to the sort of the uptake of a new type of speaking in politics. I guess my concern is just that he's a consequence and not a cause. So this is something that Steve Bannon frequently said that I actually think is oftentimes has a lot of accuracy to it, and that there's a coarseness to American politics that currently exists that he was reflective of, and he was very adept at capturing and getting people to engage with. I guess on the other side of that, I just don't know if there's going to be another person that uses Twitter as effectively as a political communication device as Trump. He really was sort of a Conor McGregor type figure, in that he just got people that weren't normally engaged in politics attention, and he used it very, very adeptly. And I'm just skeptical that there are going to be other figures that are as adept at using Twitter effective to advance their political objectives and interests in the same way that he was. So I suspect that it's part of a larger trend. I think there will be some lasting influence from it, but I think that the fact that Trump was a one-term president also creates a narrative that people, they tried it, they sort of were exposed to this, and they said, this is not something that we want to continue having in the presidency.
No, thanks. Laurie, do you want to speak on that?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree with that. I think Trump is a unique phenomenon. You can't see a Hawley or a Ted Cruz or so on being able to mobilize people in the same way. It just has the authenticity and the sort of entertainment factor, surprise factor. You never quite were sure what Trump would say next. It was never that calculated. So in that sense, I think, and if Trump has more trouble financially and in courts and so on, then I think over time his star will fade. But his star's quite strong at the moment, and it is a real problem for the Republicans. Meanwhile, Biden brings a sort of dignity and civility back to the office, and he can be long-winded, but he doesn't have the rhetorical flourishes. But at least he talks in complete sentences. So let's see what happens. Just on the alliance question. The problem for allies is that however much they don't want to be dependent upon the United States, they haven't got it costs them, it's expensive to be independent of the United States. They've got to build up their own capabilities, and they don't want to do that, not when, especially under the current economic pressure. So they know all the reasons why you can't necessarily rely on the Americans, but they're not prepared by and large to put the resources in to creating independence. That may be different to the Middle East. I think there's some big questions, I think, for some Middle Eastern countries. In terms of what the Americans expect from their allies, it's an interesting point. And I think it's one of the reasons why you see the UK, France, other European countries a bit, but those two in particular, putting attention into the Indo-Pacific region. Because they don't want to encourage a view in the administration that they're so parochial that they don't have an interest or haven't got anything to contribute to head objectives in that part of the world. So I think if there's a big challenge or crisis somewhere, that's when you do look to your allies, and if they're absent, that has as big a consequences as anything that's said in speeches or as part of political rhetoric.
May I just mention one thing really quickly here? So much of this discussion has been on whether U.S. allies can rely on the U.S. for support. But I think it is important to just point out that one of the things that Trump was reacting against when he began making these relatively novel and critical comments about NATO alliance, our alliance with NATO, for example, is that there were many U.S. allies that were not fulfilling their defense spending requirements under the NATO Charter. Their defense spending had slipped below the 2% benchmark that had been established, and this was one thing that Trump was I think rightly critical of. And in a world where you do have rising powers and Russia's ability to project power is increasing. I think that this was one area where the U.S. decision or the U.S. policy was partially in response to decisions that its allies had made in terms of sort of scaling back their commitment to military spending. The German military has suffered some real degradation in its capacity to project force. And it's an unfortunate situation, but I don't think that this was just a completely unilateral decision that Trump was making. It was actually informed by some things that are concerning.
And the point started under Obama. I mean, it didn't. It's not. The issue was there before Trump came along, and
No, indeed. I think we're getting to that point where we can start wrapping up slowly. There's a very interesting question here, and that's from Steve Burnhope, Theology and Religious Studies, graduated 2017. Part of the backdrop to Trump's 2016 victory was the so-called evangelical Christian vote, when 80% plus of those who self-identify as that voted for him. It appears that a very significant number did the same in 2020. Will Biden be able, or even wish to, make inroads into dismantling a simplistic polarity whereby the GOP is seen as the only option for those holding Christian concerns? I actually think this was also what accounted for the fact that Trump still retained a healthy, what do you call, quota, if you like, of the Black vote in the US, even in 2020 elections. What do you think? Sorry, because these are the last questions. The second one is, do you think Biden will be able to separate himself from the shadow of the Trump presidency? I guess in a sense, this is from Bezawit Zegaye. So what do you think? So please respond to any of those. Laurie?
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, I find it difficult to understand the evangelical Christian movement. So, because, you know, in the last election, you had one candidate who went to church every Sunday, genuine believer, another one who's lived a life of profanity, yeah, he was the one who was getting the Christian vote, and it's largely to do with abortion and Supreme Court votes and a culture war that has very little to do, I would submit, with religious values. But there's some signs that quite a lot of genuine Christian evangelicals are very uncomfortable with the association of Trump with that cause. But I wouldn't care to say how it will develop. I mean, I think just finally, I think the theme that we've had all the way through is the ability of Biden to get away from the shadow of Trump. I don't think it's that different for Biden himself. I think Biden's his own man. You know, he's been around for such a long time. He's got a very defined political personality of his own. He seems perfectly comfortable in his own skin. I don't think Biden himself is affected by that. And, you know, he gains lots of points just by not being Trump. I mean, that's one of his big assets. I think the problem is as he gets away from the shadow of Trump, as that and the hard problems that are still there have to be addressed, then the fact that he's not Trump ceases to be so much of an advantage.
No, thanks, Sam. And if you have any thoughts at all on this whole question of whether the GOP will remain intact in the next few years, please add your thoughts to that as well.
Okay, let me try to be succinct, given that we're running out of time here. I think Laurie made an interesting point about Trump's not being sort of a natural fit with an evangelical electorate. But I think that point just solidifies that the loyalty is based more on partisanship and partisan identity than the specific characteristics of the candidate that happens to be running for office. And I think here, again, the comment was just completely spot on, that the abortion issue is, I think, just a dominant feature, and that evangelicals have been so intimately associated with the Republican Party. I mean, stretching back to its origins as an anti-slavery organization. I'm just skeptical that Biden is going to be able to make any sort of inroad in eroding that vote. And the things that he would need to do in order to make inroads to gain evangelical strength would lose him votes from people that are currently Democrats. And so I just don't see this as being something that makes much sense for him to do politically. And I don't think that it would be feasible for him to do, even if he did think that this was something that he wanted to pursue. In terms of the Republican Party splitting apart, I think that there's a chance that you could see a third party movement that would probably be sort of composed of sort of the extreme right wing of the Republican Party, the most nativist elements that exist there, the sort of the QAnon supporter type Republican voters. And I think that the reason that there's a chance that that might emerge is because Trump would be the natural leader of that movement. So absent Trump, I don't think that there's any chance that kind of thing could emerge. I do think that the Republican Party would fight tooth and nail to prevent that from occurring, because it would erode their electoral support in ways that could really damage their ability in the next presidential election. You could have a situation where Trump was able to actually sort of effectively hand the election to the Democrats. And he might want to do that. I mean, he was not on easy terms with establishment Republicans. They simply did not get along. They did not like each other. And it was a sort of a convenient political alliance when he was in office. They could fall apart now that he's not. But I'm skeptical that he wants to do that. But I don't presume to be able to predict what Trump is going to be doing on a day-to-day basis, and I would be concerned if I could give accurate on this count.
Absolutely, Laurie. If you have one sentence to add to that, please give that last sentence, and Hannah would.
Well, I think. Well, I mean, first, I mean, generally, I agree. Again, you come back to the midterms and the pressure that Trump loyalists will put on Republicans that seem to go out of line. And I think there's going to be some big battles in the primaries, which, if they're lost, could help if they're lost to Trumpists, since could help the Democrats. Also, I mean, the way that Trump turned on McConnell, the now the Senate Minority Leader, was quite striking. And McConnell's a wily operator, and I think that was a challenge for him, to see if he can keep control of the Republican Party. So the battle's on. I don't think it's given how it will end, and it could. I doubt if it'll be a formal split, but it could see a lot of further alienation of moderate Republicans from the party.
Absolutely. No, we could go on and on. I can't believe that 1 hour has, zoomed by quickly. Let me say what a privilege it has been to have been joined by a fine colleague, Dr. Samuel DiCanio, and my mentor, always my teacher, Professor Sir Lawrence Friedman. Thank you. It's been nice to do this. Thanks a lot.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you.
Okay. Anna?
Thank you so much for me, and thank you, Laurie, thank you, Sam, for an absolutely fascinating discussion. I think, as for me said, we've only scratched the surface, haven't we? We could be talking for hours about this, but it's been wonderful to have you all here and for you to share your thoughts on such an interesting topic. And thank you very much to all of our alumni who have joined us this evening. We've had over 300 alumni on the call joining us from around the world. So it's absolutely fantastic that we can continue to bring our alumni community together wherever you're based in the world. If you would like to learn more about this topic, please do let us know in our post-event survey, and we can send some follow-up resources to you. And finally, just to let you know about a couple of next events that are coming up from the Alumni Office. So throughout March, we're hosting a new initiative called King's Let's Chat, where we'll be pairing members of our student and alumni community together for a social conversation, and would really encourage all of you to get involved. We're also really excited that we'll be hosting our 4th King's Global Day of Service throughout March. And despite these unusual times, we've got lots of ways for people to volunteer safely and remotely so that you can give back to your communities and support your own well-being as well. So do keep an eye on your inbox and on our social media channels for more information about those, as well as our future King's Expert Series events. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining this evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you all again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Funmi. And
Oh,
it was
thank
great
you.
to meet you. Thanks so much, Laura.